The luxurious mansion glowed with golden lights, as if showing off its splendor to the night sky. Marble columns stood at the entrance, crystal chandeliers glittered inside, and every corner of the hall was imbued with luxury. The air trembled with the sounds of live music, clinking glasses, and muffled conversations full of boasting and self-righteousness. Everyone here knew his own price, and the price of everyone around him. A middle-aged man stood in the center of the hall like a king whose throne was surrounded by an enthusiastic entourage. His expensive suit was impeccably tailored, and his every movement radiated confidence. He laughed loudly, exchanging sharp remarks with the other guests. His words often made those around him chuckle nervously, not out of joy, but out of fear of objection. He knew how to shut anyone up with a look, but today something unusual suddenly caught his attention. There was a faint noise at the door. The guests turned around, some out of curiosity, others with undisguised irritation. A girl in a wheelchair appeared in the center of the room. Her dark skin, sleekly combed hair, and strict black outfit stood out against the glittering dresses and suits. Her face was calm, her gaze firm, and she moved forward confidently, as if not noticing neither whispers nor stares. There was a tense silence in the room, broken only by the sound of a piano at the far end of the room. The man raised an eyebrow, then grinned. His voice broke the silence like the blow of a whip. "Is this a joke?" he asked, addressing the guests rather than her. "A new kind of entertainment? Or is this a fancy charity event?" Several people behind him chuckled, trying to hide their laughter behind their champagne glasses. But the girl didn't stop. The wheels of the wheelchair squeaked quietly as it rolled across the marble floor. She approached the piano, silently placed her hands on her knees, and only then looked up. Her eyes flashed a quick but deep look in his direction, full of something the man had not expected. It wasn't pleading or anger, it was a challenge in her eyes. The man crossed his arms over his chest, clearly enjoying the situation. "Well, dearie, show us what you can do," he said, his words sounding like spit. "But I warn you, I don't like falseness, so try not to disappoint us." The girl did not answer. Her hands, slightly trembling, rested on the keys. The guests stood in tense anticipation. Someone took out his phone, preparing to film another show. The man grinned. He was sure he was about to see a ridiculous parody of music. But something strange had already begun to thicken in the air, something he couldn't yet explain. When the girl's fingers touched the keys, the first note ripped through the tension like a sharp blade. But that was only the first blow, and there was more to come. The man stood leaning on the drink table, watching the girl in the wheelchair. His grin trembled faintly on his lips, though he didn't realize it. Something inside him twitched, unconscious, almost unpleasant. He turned away from the piano and took a sip of champagne. The flavor of the drink suddenly reminded him of other times, other surroundings, ones he didn't like to remember. Memories surfaced without warning, like sunken ships that suddenly rose to the surface. He saw his father, a tall man with a sharp face whose eyes were always squinted, as if searching for flaws. As a child, that face had been synonymous with fear for him. His father had no tolerance for weakness. "Only the strong survive in this world," he repeated like a mantra. The slightest mistake, the slightest show of kindness or sympathy was severely punished. One day, a little boy, his neighbor, fell and tore his knee. The blood ran down his leg and he cried. The future owner of this hall rushed to his aid, but his father saw this and sharply called out to him, "Do you think he will thank you?" Men like him were born to be dirt under our feet. Leave him alone. Let him learn to be strong or die weak." He froze, stunned by these words, but he obeyed. His father was not to be disobeyed. That day was the first time he felt pity become something shameful. The next time, he was already laughing himself at someone who looked vulnerable. It was a skinny boy with dirty skin and tattered pants who clumsily dropped his bag. Instead of helping, he mockingly kicked it with his foot. His father watched him from a distance and nodded approvingly. "Way to go, son," he said later. These were lessons he had learned forever. The world was harsh. People divided into the strong and the weak, the masters and those born to obey, especially those whose skin was darker. His father called such people ballast. "They only drag our world down," he used to say at dinner. Over the years, the man had learned to view others, especially those who were different from him, through a prism of superiority. Blacks, the poor, the handicapped, they were all signs of weakness to him, like that girl at the piano. He saw her presence here as a challenge. It was unacceptable. There was no place in his world for someone like her. His gaze slid back to the girl, now with a subtle, barely perceptible anger. She continued to play as if the world around her didn't exist. That was what angered him the most. Her calmness, her confidence. She didn't look at him with fear, as others were used to doing. He felt that her music was somehow trying to reach out to him, to a part of him that he'd buried under years of scorn and hatred. He frowned, pushing the memories away. This evening was not for nostalgia, but deep down, he knew this evening was already out of his control. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you listened to our stories from and whether you had something similar in your life. Share your opinions and experiences. It's important. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on exciting new stories. We continue. The room froze as the girl in the wheelchair approached the piano. Her movements were slow but sure. The wheels of her wheelchair squeaked on the polished marble floor, and that was the only thing that broke the silence. She stopped in front of the piano without touching the keys. The guests looked at each other, their whispers quiet but filled with condemnation. A man with a glass of champagne in his hand stepped closer, his voice louder than necessary, filling the room. "Do you even know how to play, or were you just attracting attention?" These words struck like a whip. The guests laughed, some heartily, others nervously, not daring to object. The man took another sip and continued. "Maybe you wanted to show us a trick, how to operate a wheelchair, or is this a new way of asking for alms?" The laughter sounded louder. The girl slowly raised her head, her eyes coldly meeting his gaze. She said nothing, but there was more power in that silence than in a dozen words. "Come on, show us how you can do it." The man pointed to the piano, grinning. "Or is this going to be the most pathetic show of the evening?" His venom-soaked words elicited a wave of approving laughter in the room. Several guests began to whisper that this was clearly a misunderstanding. "Who let her in here in the first place?" came a voice. She didn't answer. Her hands slowly rose and fell to the keys. The first touch was almost imperceptible. There was no sound. The man hummed, spreading his arms wide. "Well, there you go. What did I tell you? Waste of time." But suddenly, the first note broke through the hum of voices like a faint whisper. The guests fell silent again. It was not music, but an almost painful sound, but it held their attention. The girl played slowly, as if choosing each note with care. The man watched with his arms folded across his chest. Irritation flickered in his gaze. That irritation was born not from her music, but from the way she ignored his words, his presence, his power. He was used to being respected or feared. She, on the other hand, showed neither. Her hands began to move faster, the sound louder. The music gradually filled the room, crowding out the remnants of laughter. But that made the man even angrier. "Is that the best you can do?" he threw, shouting over the melody. "Simple sounds, no emotion. Is this some pathetic attempt to prove something?" But her game wasn't interrupted. The guests began to look at her differently. Some stopped laughing, their eyes filled with curiosity. She continued to play without lifting her head, completely focused on the keys. The man stepped closer, his voice quieter but even more venomous. "Do you think music can change anything? You'll never be an equal here, no matter how much you play. Look at you. You're pathetic." Those words hung in the air like knives ready to fall. The girl didn't stop, but her fingers froze for a moment, as if deflecting a blow. The man grinned, thinking he had gotten his way. But he was wrong. Her music suddenly changed. The notes became sharp, strong, piercing. It wasn't just a melody. It was a scream, denouncing all who laughed. The man felt his throat go dry. It was the first moment when he felt he was losing control of the situation. No one laughed anymore. The hall became as quiet as a funeral. And it was a silence in which the truth was hidden. It was beginning to win. Her fingers glided across the piano keys, but the music they made was more than just sound. Each chord was an embodiment of her pain, each transition from one note to the next, a reminder of the past. Deep inside her, beneath her restrained face, memories raged. They came to the surface, blurring the line between the present and the past. She was only 8 when the accident happened. The rumble of metal, the screech of tires, the screams, and the silence filled with fear. She remembered opening her eyes and realizing her legs were no longer moving. The doctors, the warm words that changed nothing, and the cold, merciless verdict. "You will never walk again." It was her first encounter with a reality that would never be merciful. Since then, her life has been a series of battles. She heard more ridicule than words of encouragement. At school, the teasing was relentless. "Broken doll," the children shouted, pointing to her wheelchair. Teachers ignored her, as if they were afraid her presence would cast a shadow on their normal students. She always noticed the looks, full of pity, contempt, disgust, especially from adults. Once, when she was 13, her mother brought her to music school. The teacher, an elderly man with a bushy mustache, took one look at her and told her mother right to her face, "Music is not for people like her. It requires discipline, strength. Why are you wasting your time?" She didn't cry then. Instead, she looked him straight in the eye, just as she was looking at the man in the hall now. Her mother had taken her home, but that night was the first time she had ever asked decisively, "Find me a teacher, Mother. I'll prove it to them all." Music became her salvation. Every chord she played was her voice, her answer to the ridicule, to the rejection, to a world that refused to accept her as she was. But the music couldn't drown everything out. She remembered the moments that burned her heart out. At the mall, some white-skinned woman had stepped away from her as if she were a leper, whispering, "They always look like that, helpless, dirty." She had to fight it every day. Every rejection was another wall she had to break down. And tonight, this stage, this piano, this man with his icy gaze, was another such wall. She knew what he was thinking. She could see it in his eyes, the contempt, the conviction of his superiority. To him, she was nothing. Just another weak, another not like that. A black girl in a wheelchair could not be worthy of his attention, could not be his equal. But she had long ago learned not to listen to the likes of him. Her music was her answer, her challenge. Each chord she played was louder and stronger, a shield against his words. Her fingers continued to move across the keys, but inside she saw not the hall, not the guests, not his mockery. She saw herself, the little girl who heard she could never make it, the girl who cried nights only to smile in the morning as if her world wasn't crumbling. This man was just another sound in a cacophony she'd long ago learned to ignore. But tonight she would play it for him. She would make him feel what she felt, make him see her power that he had so studiously refused to notice. When her fingers finished the last chord, there was a dead silence in the hall. It was her victory. Her music echoed in every heart, even if they would never admit it. The man stood silent. He expected a broken girl, but before him sat the victorious girl. The first sound that came out of the piano was faint, barely perceptible. Someone in the room chuckled softly, and that chuckle became a chain reaction. The man, standing in the center of the room, snorted loudly, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. "That's it? That's like the most pathetic thing I've heard all night. Can we get back to some real music?" The guests' laughter intensified, their gazes filled with contempt. Several people looked at each other, raising their glasses as if this moment was worthy of a toast. Someone muttered quietly, "People like her always try, but they never succeed." The girl inhaled deeply. Her fingers froze over the keys, trembling with tension. This moment was familiar to her to the point of pain. She had heard similar words dozens of times, but today they seemed especially sharp. It was a blow to her pride, her dignity. A fire raged inside her, but instead of burning her from the inside out, that fire fueled her resolve. She would not let this man, these people, see her weakness. Her fingers began to move, touching the keys again. The first notes were tentative, as if afraid to come into the light. But she didn't stop. She knew that music was her weapon. Every chord, every melody was her voice, her shout in the face of those who didn't want to hear it. The man rolled his eyes and announced loudly, "Let's just admit it was a bad decision. Looks like someone thought pity would replace talent." The laughter broke out again, even louder. Her music was getting stronger, but that laughter, those words, they were like sharp stones thrown at her from different directions. She gritted her teeth, her hands sliding over the keys with more confidence. The guests, who had been laughing recently, began to fall silent one by one. Something in her playing was changing. The notes grew louder, more intense, filling the room. The music grew like a wave, rising higher and higher, engulfing everyone. The laughter began to turn into tense silence. The man frowned, keeping his eyes on her. His contemptuous grin faded, giving way to irritation. He didn't understand why her playing appealed to him, why the music emanating from the fingers of this girl in a wheelchair made him strangely uneasy. It was unacceptable. "Do you really think that's going to make a difference?" he said, trying to keep his imperious tone. "People don't listen to people who look like you. You'll never get beyond pity." She did not answer. The music was her answer, sharp and piercing like a thunderclap. Her melody turned into an emotional storm of pain, anger, defiance. It wasn't just playing, it was the cry of her soul, heard by everyone in the room. The man took a step forward, his face tense, but he was still trying to keep his mask of indifference. He couldn't let his inner turmoil become visible, but his hands trembled as he set his glass on the table. He couldn't ignore this music. Its sounds seemed to reach into the very depths of his soul, bringing to light something he'd buried long ago. The rest of the guests stood in tense silence. No one laughed anymore. Even those who a moment ago had let themselves be mocked could not take their eyes off the girl. Her music told a story they could not understand, but which they felt with every cell of their bodies. Her fingers moved faster, each chord louder, each note hit in her chest like a hammer. The man clenched his fists. He felt himself losing control. He was used to being strong, to being the one who dominated, but now this girl in the wheelchair was destroying his world. He opened his mouth again to say something, to ruin this moment, but the words stuck in his throat. Her music was too loud, too powerful, too real. He felt small, insignificant in front of this power he couldn't understand or control. When the last chord sounded, the room fell into silence again. It was not the kind of silence that accompanies a polite pause after a performance. It was a silence filled with something deep, something that could not be ignored. The girl slowly raised her head. Her gaze met the man's eyes. She said nothing, but there was everything in her eyes: defiance, strength, victory. He couldn't stand that look. He turned away, but he knew he couldn't erase that moment. The room froze as the music began to gain strength. The first notes were like breathing, barely perceptible, but then the sound began to fill the space. It wasn't just a melody. It was a confession. The pain that lurked in every note echoed with strength and hope that broke through the thick layer of despair. The music seemed to pull the air out of the room, making everyone feel its weight. The man standing nearby frowned. His sneer faded slowly, replaced by something he couldn't immediately recognize. For the first time in a long time, he felt insecure. This was stupid, of course. Some black girl in a wheelchair had no effect on him. They were just sounds, he reminded himself, just keystrokes. But the music spoke to him. It was breaking through the walls he had built up over the years. Its rhythm, its tone, its ruthless sincerity was forcing him to remember what he had so carefully hidden: pain, fear, loneliness. He couldn't understand why those notes evoked such emotion in him. The guests, who had been whispering derisively, were now silent. Their gazes, previously filled with contempt, were now fixed on the girl. The music had taken over them, crowding out everything else. Even the most ardent skeptic in the audience could not ignore this power. The man tried to distract himself. He poured himself more champagne, took a big sip, but the taste was sour. Everything around him was losing its usual brightness, as if this music was not only filling the room, but erasing all his former beliefs from it. Every note sounded like it was directed at him personally. The music told a story he didn't want to hear, a story of broken people who refused to give up, a story of those he used to despise, but who rose above in spite of it. He recalled scenes from the past, the boy he had refused to help, laughing at his tears. The young woman he had humiliated by throwing her change like a dog. He remembered even his own employees who barely looked him in the eye, afraid of his cruel comments. But what struck him most was how the music made him feel. Its melody evoked something he had buried as a child. He thought he could hear his mother's voice rebuking him for his cruelty. He thought he saw the face of that boy with the broken knee. At some point, he realized that the music had changed. It wasn't just sad anymore. There was power in it. It was a challenge to the world. It was a demonstration of resilience that could not be broken. A girl in a wheelchair sat at the piano with a straight back. Her fingers moved with such confidence as if they held the whole world. Her face remained calm, but her music spoke louder than any words. She didn't ask for pity. She didn't ask for approval. Her melody was a statement. I am here, and you can't ignore me. The man felt sweat beading on his forehead. This girl, who he thought was nothing, was doing something he could never do. She had taken the pain of her life and turned it into power. He clenched his fists as if that could keep his inner world from shattering. But it was too late. The music penetrated deeper and deeper, tearing him apart. He wanted to turn away, but he couldn't. Her last chord sounded like a thunderclap. The guests were left standing in silence as if they dared not even breathe. She lifted her hands from the keys, dropping them to her knees, and looked up at the audience for the first time. Her eyes met his, and he felt his breath hitch. It was neither the look of a victor nor the look of a victim. It was the look of a man who knew his power, and he, used to being the master, felt insignificant for the first time. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you listened to our stories from and whether you had something similar in your life. Share your impressions and emotions. It's always valuable. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the continuation. We continue. The sound of the music slowly dissolved into the air, leaving behind a heavy, almost palpable silence. The man stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the girl in the wheelchair. Her melody, her gaze, her presence, all of it was breaking through his consciousness, leaving painful traces. Every chord from a few minutes ago reminded him of something he'd tried to forget, erase, bury under layers of arrogance and contempt. He felt the air in the room begin to press against him. The guests stood silent, their gazes darting between the girl and the man, waiting for his reaction. But he could say nothing. Scenes from the past, vivid, painful, still bitter, reverberated in his mind. He saw them, the people he had humiliated, men and women whose eyes filled with tears but who never dared to object. A boy with dirty hands who once tried to sell him flowers and he pushed him away so hard he fell to the ground. A woman, a black woman, who begged him to give her a job, and he laughed and said that they don't keep them in the company. Every memory came alive with this girl's music. Her playing seemed to draw out his dirtiest, most shameful moments. He wanted to close his eyes, but he couldn't. He was trapped in this moment, as if chained to it. Her gaze, that was the worst of it. She was looking directly at him with a kind of frightening understanding. She seemed to see everything, his fears, his mistakes, his hatred. It was not the look of a victim. It was the look of a judge who knows the accused is guilty. He remembered once, as a young man, standing in front of a black man who tried to argue with him about justice. "You think your words mean anything?" he said then, grinning. "No one can hear your voice. You're not a man. You're just a shadow." Those words, so familiar to him then, now rang in his head like a curse. The girl's music continued to play in his mind. It wasn't just a sound. It was a truth he could no longer deny. In that melody was his whole life, but not from the side he was used to seeing it. It was the story of his cruelty, his arrogance, his fear of those he considered beneath him. He felt his throat constrict. He found it hard to breathe. A moment ago he'd been sure of his power, his right to despise her, to laugh at her. Now he stood before her as if naked, stripped of his pride. The guests began to whisper. Some of them were beginning to understand what had just happened, but the man did not hear them. He looked at the girl, at her hands, which now rested calmly on the armrests of the wheelchair, at her eyes, which did not avert their gaze. "Why does she look like she knows me?" he thought. That question was eating him up inside. He wanted to turn away, but he couldn't. She didn't say a word, but her silence spoke louder than any accusation. The man felt something inside him crack. It was his facade, the solid wall he'd built his whole life to avoid feeling, to avoid remembering. This girl, her music, her gaze, it was all shattering him, leaving only fear, shame, and confusion. He took a step back, feeling the ground beneath him shaky. For the first time in a long time he felt small, insignificant. His world, where he was the master, was crumbling under the gaze of the girl in the wheelchair, and in that moment he realized the truth. His superiority, his confidence in his strength, it was all a lie. He was weak, and she, sitting before him, was stronger than he could ever be. That truth swept over him like a wave, and he didn't know if she could ever let him go. The man rose abruptly from his seat, causing the nearest guest to flinch in surprise. His face was tense, and his lips were pressed into a thin line. No one dared to ask what was wrong. Even the air in the room seemed to stiffen, saturated with his inner struggle. He took a few quick steps, leaving behind the sound of the piano, now hushed but still echoing in his head. He left the hall, slamming the heavy oak door behind him. He paused in the hallway, lit by the dim light of the candelabra, leaning heavily against the wall. His hands trembled, and he raised them to his face, as if trying to shield himself from an invisible enemy. But the enemy was inside his own memories, which now came with such force that they seemed almost tangible. He remembered her, that girl he'd made fun of years ago. She was standing at the entrance to the office building, crying, begging for help. Her voice was quiet, punctuated by sobs. She had just lost her job and her young child was sick. The man stopped in front of her then, not out of sympathy, but out of curiosity. Her tears were something ordinary to him, a part of his life where the weak always pleaded with the strong. "Why can't you just pull yourself together?" he'd said to her then, with a smirk that now seemed unbearable to him. "Maybe you should think about trying to work somewhere that takes people like you." He remembered how her face contorted in pain, how she sobbed, trying to say something. But he didn't listen. He liked seeing her tears, her helplessness. It made him feel stronger. He walked away, leaving her standing there with her arms wrapped around her worn bag. Now those memories came upon him with renewed force. He saw her face, her tears, and it was like a red-hot iron burning him from the inside out. He realized that that girl standing outside the office and that girl in the wheelchair at the piano were part of the same world he despised, and which, in turn, now despised him. His legs gave out, and he sank to the nearest couch. The corridor seemed endless, its walls pressing against him like they were trying to squeeze him in a vise. He ran his hands over his face, trying to erase the memories, but they only intensified. He saw the faces of all those he had humiliated, those he considered beneath him, those he considered unworthy of respect. Those faces wouldn't let him go. He remembered a moment at a business dinner when he had laughed out loud at a black waiter who had accidentally spilled wine. "Do you even know how much that suit cost?" he said then, loud enough for everyone to hear. The people at the table laughed, but the waiter only lowered his eyes in silence. Now these scenes were his personal hell. He tried to justify himself, to tell himself that the world was cruel, that the weak must learn to survive. but the words that had seemed right to him before now sounded hollow and false. The girl at the piano appeared before his inner gaze again. Her gaze, her music. It wasn't a complaint, it was a challenge. She wasn't begging him, asking for pity. She made him feel what he had refused to feel all his life. He closed his eyes, but it didn't help. Her image stayed with him, her music still playing. He wanted to break free, wanted to go back into the hall and scream that none of this was true, that he was strong, that he was right. But he knew it was a lie. He was no longer strong. Everything he had built was built on contempt, on fear, on hate. That girl in the wheelchair had destroyed him without a word. Tears came to his eyes, but he clenched his teeth, forcing them not to spill. He couldn't afford to cry. He had never cried before. But inside, he was already broken. The door to the hall opened, letting the man back inside. The sound of applause came over him like a wave, knocking him off his feet. It wasn't the usual polite clapping of hands that usually marked a boring performance. It was a flurry, fierce and sincere, an applause that sounded as if the whole hall was expressing gratitude for something more than just the music. The man froze in the doorway. The guests stood, many with moist eyes. Those who had recently laughed and whispered were now clapping so hard that their palms were reddening. They looked at the girl at the piano with an awe that was hard to ignore. She sat there, motionless as a statue, but her face glowed. It was not an expression of pride or triumph. It was the calm of a person who knows that she has spoken her truth and is no longer afraid. Her hands rested on the armrests of her wheelchair, and her gaze glided around the room, seeking neither praise nor approval. The man felt as if his feet were stuck to the floor. He didn't know what to do, where to look. It was a feeling he had never experienced before, the full realization of his powerlessness. Her music continued to play in his head, echoing in a way he couldn't drown out. With each step he took forward, something inside him crumbled. His pride, his arrogance, all of it fell away like husks, leaving him naked, weak. The guests paid no attention to him. All eyes were fixed on her. As he got closer, he felt his hands shaking. It was hard for him to breathe. Her gaze suddenly stopped on him, and it was like a blow. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't looking at him in triumph. There was the same confidence in her eyes that he'd seen before, but now he noticed something else in them. Forgiveness. This forgiveness was more painful to him than any condemnation. He was used to being despised, but this girl didn't despise him. She looked at him as if she knew what he was, but she still didn't hold a grudge. He opened his mouth to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. He tried to make excuses, wanted to explain why he'd laughed, why he'd said what he'd said, but something in her gaze stopped him. She knew he was wrong, and her music had already said all that needed to be said. The applause was still rumbling, but the man didn't hear it. The melody that had drawn out the truth he refused to see was still playing in his head. Her music was his sentence, and he could not appeal it. He knelt down next to her wheelchair, not realizing what he was doing. He was short of breath, but he forced himself to speak. It was. His voice shook, and he closed his eyes. I was wrong. Her gaze didn't change. She didn't respond. She didn't need his apology, didn't seek it, but he felt he needed it himself. The guests began to sink into their seats, but the atmosphere in the hall remained intense, heavy as a storm cloud. Each of them felt that they had witnessed something important, something that had changed them all. The man rose, but his pride remained there, on the floor, at her feet. He looked at the girl, and for the first time in his life, he saw before him not an object of scorn, but a human being, strong, worthy, better than himself. Her music had destroyed him, but at the same time it had given him a chance to start over. He stood in front of her, clenching his fists to stifle a shiver. The air around him seemed to thicken, making every movement heavy. The girl in the wheelchair looked at him, her gaze direct but not burning. She showed no anger, no contempt, not even expectation. Her eyes were calm, but in that calmness was a power he feared more than any rage. He tried to find the words. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. Every time he started to speak, memories of what he'd said to other people like her came to mind. All the barbs, the taunts, the outright hatred that had once seemed normal to him were now coming at him like an avalanche. She didn't rush him. Her hands rested calmly on the armrests of the wheelchair, her posture straight. This was further destroying him. He was used to the weak breaking down, to people hiding under his gaze. But she was different. She didn't ask for forgiveness or excuses. "Thank you," he mumbled finally, his voice barely audible. He didn't realize himself why he'd said it. What was he thanking her for? For the pain she had caused him? For the way she had shattered his world? Or for the way her music had made him see himself for who he really was? The girl smiled. It was not a triumphant smile, not a sneer. It was a smile of understanding, warm and sincere. Her eyes sparkled, as if she saw something in him that he couldn't yet see. The moment lasted a few seconds, but to him it felt like an eternity. He felt something in him change, the old rotten part of his personality crumbling, giving way to something new. But with it came the realization that this was not the end, but the beginning of a long journey. He took a step back, as if giving her the space she deserved. The guests in the room were still watching, but their gazes were no longer full of contempt. Even those who were used to his domineering demeanor now looked at him with something resembling pity. The man turned and began to walk away slowly. His steps were heavy, but he knew he had to leave to make sense of everything that had just happened. It wasn't an escape, it was a search for himself. She stayed at the piano, her face still calm. For her, this was another battle she had won, but she knew it wouldn't be the last. Her life had been full of battles like this, but each one made her stronger. When he left the hall, he felt as if he were seeing the world in a new way. The faces of those he used to think of as insignificant now seemed alive, full of emotions and stories he had never bothered to understand. He knew there was a long road ahead. Not only did he have to change his attitude, but he had to atone for the mistakes he had made. This moment didn't erase his guilt, but it gave him a chance to be someone better. The girl at the piano smiled again, quietly, to herself. She knew that not everyone was ready to change, that not everyone saw the strength to do so. But today she saw something new in his eyes. It wasn't forgiveness for her, but forgiveness for himself, which he had only just begun to find. For him, it was the beginning of a journey of change. For her, it was another victory. She proved again that it doesn't matter who you are or what others think of you. It's all about being yourself and letting your power speak for you. The evening had come to an end, but its echoes remained in the air. The guests left in silence, avoiding discussion of what had happened. The events of the evening whispered through their minds like a barely perceptible whisper. They knew that they had witnessed something unusual, something that might have changed not only the man, but also themselves. The man walked through the cold night air, feeling his heart pounding too loudly in his chest. He wanted to go far away, away from the light and people, to give himself time. But the girl's music was still playing in his mind, keeping him awake. Questions began to form in his mind that he would never have asked himself before. Why did he hate people like her? Why did he let his contempt rule his life? How could he have been so blind to their power? He stopped at the parking lot, but didn't get into the car. Instead, he sank down on the bench, feeling his breathing become ragged. He stared up at the night sky, trying to find answers. The past, like a ghost, came back to him again and again. He thought he could see the faces of those he had humiliated. They were standing in front of him, looking at him with pain, and their gazes were too heavy for him to bear. He wanted to apologize to all of them, but he knew it was impossible. His fingers trembled as he pulled out his phone. He went into contacts, saw his assistant's number, and dialed it. "Hello?" His voice was hoarse, as if after a long struggle. "Tomorrow morning, I want you to assemble the entire staff. We need to review company policy, especially with regard to those who are usually overlooked." The assistant froze on the other end of the line. She knew him as a tough man who rarely did anything without benefit to himself. "Of course, sir. Did something happen?" He closed his eyes for a second. "Yeah, it happened." As he finished speaking, he felt a small weight fall from his shoulders. This was just the beginning. He realized that it was impossible to change his life in one evening, but this first step was important. Meanwhile, the girl in the wheelchair was alone in the hall. When she was sure that everyone had left, she breathed a sigh of relief. It had been a difficult evening, but she knew it had been worth it. Her music had done what she wanted it to do. As she left the auditorium, she saw an empty stage, but there was warmth in her heart. She knew that every moment like this brought her closer to her goal of creating a world where her voice would be heard. The man and the girl never crossed paths again that night, but deep down, each knew that night was the beginning for both of them. He began to search for a path to redemption. She strengthened her faith in the power of her actions. The echoes of that night would stay with them forever, changing their lives and those who would become part of their stories. It was not just a collision of two worlds, but a moment that showed that change is possible if you have the courage to embrace it. A few days passed. The man woke up in his large, luxurious house, but for the first time he felt that the place seemed empty to him. His familiar routine, which used to be a comfortable refuge for him, now seemed meaningless. The music of that girl was still playing in his head. It was no longer just a melody. It was a voice that wouldn't let him forget what had happened. He sat at the desk in his office, staring at a pile of papers. Contracts, reports, schedules, everything that had once seemed vital now seemed distant and insignificant. His thoughts wandered to that night, to her gaze, to her strength. He picked up a pen and began to write. It was not a business document, but a letter. He didn't know if it would reach her, but he felt he had to express what was choking him inside. "I know that my words cannot erase what I have said and done. I know that my pride and hatred has hurt many, and probably you among them. But your music made me see myself for who I really was. You shattered what I thought was my superiority and gave me a chance to start over. Thank you for that. I will try to become a better person, though I know it will be a long road." He read the letter several times, feeling its words become to him not only a confession, but a promise to himself. Then he put it in the envelope and called his driver. The girl in the wheelchair was in a small park where she liked to spend her mornings. Here she drew inspiration as she prepared for her next concert. She knew that every time she went on stage was another challenge, another step towards being heard. As her wheels squeaked on the gravel, a young man in a courier's uniform approached her. "This is for you," he said, handing her an envelope. She looked up at him in surprise but accepted the letter. Opening it, she began to read. Her face remained calm, but there was a faint smile at the corner of her lips. She read the letter to the end, then folded it carefully and put it in her bag. She didn't know if this man would change, if he would keep his promise, but she felt that in that moment she had done more than just play a tune. She had touched the heart of someone who seemed beyond the reach of change. That evening, the man returned to his office. He called his employees to a meeting where, for the first time in years, he didn't talk about profits or percentages or competitors. He talked about people, about the importance of seeing them not as part of a system, but as individuals. The words came hard to him, but he could see the sparkle in the eyes of some of the staff. For the first time in a long time, he felt that he was being listened to out of interest rather than fear. The girl, at this time, was preparing for her next concert. She knew that the world would not change overnight, but she believed that every performance left a mark. It might not be a big one, but it was important. Their lives no longer intersected, but they both knew that the evening they spent together had changed their destinies. The man took the first step towards redemption, and the girl strengthened her faith in the power of art to break down the walls built by hatred and prejudice. And though they were from different worlds, their stories appeared to be connected in that one evening. One tune, one clash of views could change everything. A few months passed. The city lived its usual life, but for two people it became completely different. The man who had once considered himself the top of the world, and the girl in a wheelchair who had shattered his illusions with her art, no longer crossed paths. However, their lives now followed orbits that intersected only in memories. The man stood at the window of his office, looking out at the city streets. His reflection in the glass no longer looked familiar to him. He had changed. The change was slow, painful, but it was real. He no longer looked at people with contempt. He began to listen, began to notice their stories. The office had a new rule. Hiring became open to everyone, regardless of color, physical ability, or other differences. He hired several employees with disabilities, supported an initiative to help people from marginalized communities. For him, this was not just a business endeavor. It became a personal mission. His staff noticed the change. They were no longer afraid of him, although their respect for him was different. It was no longer based on fear, but on the understanding that he was trying to be better. The girl in the wheelchair, meanwhile, continued to perform. Her music won hearts, and her story inspired thousands. Her concerts attracted people of all ages and backgrounds. Every time she sat down at the piano, she knew that her music was a voice that spoke for the unheard. On one such evening, she received an invitation to a big charity concert organized to support people with disabilities. She accepted without hesitation, knowing that every chord she played could be the beginning of a new path for someone. When she arrived at the event, she noticed a familiar face in the crowd. It was him, the same man. He didn't approach her, didn't try to get her attention. He just stood in the shadows watching as she prepared to go on stage. His gaze was different. There was no more arrogance in it, only respect and quiet gratitude. She noticed him, but she didn't show it. They didn't need words. Everything that needed to be said had already been said that night. When she began to play, he closed his eyes. The music filled the hall, and he felt something new ignite inside him. It wasn't guilt, it wasn't shame, it was hope. Hope that maybe he could change not only himself, but something more. Her music, as always, told a story of pain, strength, hope, and forgiveness, a story in which everyone could find themselves. And when the last chord sounded, applause filled the hall. The man looked at her, realizing that his journey was just beginning, and she sat at the piano, her face glowing with serenity. Their stories would never cross again. But in that moment, they both knew. The world was a little better because each of them had found the strength to change it. That was their new tune. The end. Write in the comments what you think about this story. Have there been racist incidents or moments in your life that have made you reconsider how you treat other people? We really need to hear what you think, because each of you is incredibly valuable to us. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and put a like to support us. We wish you a good and bright day.